The morning after her mother was buried, Lydia Vale came home and found every lock changed. Her stepfather stood on the porch with a folded paper and her suitcase. He told her the house was no longer hers. He told her the debts were real. He told her a 20-year-old girl had no business arguing with county records. By sundown, Lydia was walking the logging road with one coat, $3, and the kind of silence that makes a person feel already erased. The only roof she could afford was a closed mapmaker's cabin, a place the county had marked useless for years. The roof leaked. The windows were blind with moss. Inside, old maps curled on the walls like dead leaves, and a drafting table sagged beneath decades of dust. People laughed when they heard she had gone there. But what nobody knew was that Lydia's mother had spent years teaching her how to read the smallest lies in a line. And under that ruined drafting table, behind woods swollen by rain, Lydia found the first mark that did not match the county map. It did not only suggest her stepfather had lied. It suggested someone had been redrawing the truth long before Lydia was born. To understand why Lydia did not scream at the locked door, you have to know what her mother had hidden in the sewing tin. It was not money. Lydia had checked that first, with the panic of a girl who had spent 3 weeks counting bread, lamp oil, and funeral flowers by the penny. Inside the round blue tin were 6 needles, a bent silver thimble, 2 black buttons, and a folded scrap of brown paper tucked beneath the cotton. Her mother had written only 5 marks on it, 3 short lines, 1 bent hook, a number that looked unfinished. Lydia had found it the night before the burial, while packing away Ruth Vale's dresses because she could not bear to see them hanging in the wardrobe like someone might still come home and wear them. At first, she thought the marks were for hemming cloth. Her mother had been a careful woman. She measured curtains twice before cutting. She marked jars in the cellar. She folded receipts by month and tied them with thread. But Ruth Vale had also taught her daughter stranger things. When Lydia was 8, her mother drew lines in flour across the kitchen table and made her guess which one marked a creek, which one marked a fence, and which one had been moved by a man who wanted more than he owned. When Lydia complained, her mother only said, "A line can be a promise, Lydia, or it can be a theft wearing good ink." Back then, Lydia thought grief lived in old women and maps. Now grief stood on her own porch wearing her stepfather's Sunday coat. Calvin Mercer did not look at the black ribbon still pinned to Lydia's dress. He held the folded paper as if it were a clean thing. But Lydia saw the crease where someone had opened it too many times before deciding how to show it. "There are debts," he said. His voice had the patience of a man performing kindness for witnesses. 2 neighbors had stopped by the lane. Mrs. Alder pretended to study the weeds near the fence. Mr. Pruitt kept his hat against his chest and stared at the ground. Lydia reached for the paper. Calvin did not give it to her. "The bank has already reviewed it," he said. "Your mother understood what she signed." That was the first lie Lydia could see. Not because she was a lawyer. Not because she knew the inside of the courthouse. She saw it because Ruth Vale had once made her compare ink on old seed orders. Fresh ink held a shine. Old ink sank into the paper like rain into dry ground. The signature on the debt note was dull and brown. The date above it was black enough to catch the morning light. Lydia looked up. Calvin's face did not change, but his fingers tightened around the paper. Before she could speak, a carriage stopped at the end of the lane. Harlan Voss stepped down without dust on his boots. That was what Lydia noticed first. Every road in Bryan County carried dust in dry weather, but the banker looked as if the earth had been warned not to touch him. He was tall, narrow, and clean-shaven, with a gray hat and a smile that made sympathy feel like a locked door. "Miss Vale," he said, "this is a painful morning. No one wants to make it worse." Calvin lowered his eyes. That was when Lydia understood the paper on the porch had not come from her stepfather alone. Voss spoke gently, but every gentle word placed another board over the doorway. The estate was complicated. The debts were unfortunate. The county records were clear. A young woman alone should not put herself through public embarrassment by challenging documents she did not understand. Then he said something that turned Lydia's stomach cold. It would be wiser not to involve the Marr cabin. Lydia had not said that name. She had only heard it from her mother once, 3 winters before, when Ruth was feverish and believed the room was darker than it was. "Elias Marr," she had whispered, kept the old lines where rain could not wash them away. Then she gripped Lydia's wrist and said, "If the house ever shuts you out, Do not go to the church. Do not go to the bank. Follow the line that bends. At the time, Lydia thought sickness had made her mother speak nonsense. Now the banker knew the nonsense by name. Why would I go there? Lydia asked. Voss smiled as if she had proved something. Because grief makes people cling to useless places. Calvin shoved the suitcase toward her feet. Inside were not all her clothes, only the plain ones. Her mother's cedar box was missing. So was the old orchard map that had always been folded beneath the family Bible. Lydia wanted to push past him. She wanted to tear through the bedroom, the drawers, the kitchen where her mother had kept every honest receipt. But Voss's carriage waited at the lane. The neighbors were watching, and Calvin held the paper just far enough back that she would have to grab for it like a thief. So Lydia did the only thing her mother had taught her to do when a line was drawn against her. She looked closely. At the ink. At the date. At Calvin's thumb hiding the lower corner. At the way Voss had named a cabin no one had mentioned. Then she picked up the suitcase. She did not walk toward the church. She did not walk toward the bank. At the bend in the logging road, she opened the blue sewing tin again and held the scrap of paper against the fading light. The last mark was not a stitch. It was a direction. The logging road did not begin like a road. It began as two pale ruts behind the last feed store, then narrowed between blackberry canes and pine trunks until Lydia had to turn sideways to keep her suitcase from catching. The sky had gone the color of cold pewter. Behind her, Briar Creek was pulling its curtains shut, one yellow window after another, as if the town could close its eyes and make her disappear. She had bought a heel of bread with one of her $3 and wrapped it in a handkerchief. The shopkeeper did not refuse her, but he set the loaf on the counter without touching her fingers. Bad night to be walking north, he said. I am not going far. That made him look up. No one asked where she was going after that. People in Briar County had a way of protecting themselves from the truth by pretending they had not heard it. At the hitching post, two boys stopped whispering when she passed. Outside the barber shop, Mr. Pruitt lowered his eyes again, the same way he had lowered them at her porch. Only old Mrs. Alder spoke. That cabin took the sense out of Elias Marr, she called from her gate. Don't let it take yours. Lydia kept walking, but the name moved beside her like a second shadow. Elias Marr, the man her mother had mentioned in fever. The man Harlan Voss had named without being asked. The man the town remembered only as a warning. At the first bend, Lydia opened the sewing tin and unfolded the scrap again. 3 short lines. 1 bent hook. The unfinished number. She held the paper beside the road, turning it until the hook matched the curve ahead, where the logging trail left the wagon track and dipped toward the pines. Her mother had not drawn a stitch. She had drawn the bend. That was the first thing that made Lydia afraid. The second came 20 minutes later. A pine beside the trail had been marked with 3 cuts, each one shallow, clean, and old enough for bark to have grown around the wound. Lydia brushed moss away with her thumb. Beneath it was the same bent hook. Not similar, the same. For a moment, she heard her mother's voice at the kitchen table. If 2 lines agree in places they should not, ask who needed them to. Lydia looked back down the trail. No one was there. Still, she felt watched. The pines stood too close together. Somewhere deeper in the woods, water struck stone in slow drops. By the time she saw the cabin, dusk had thickened under the trees. It crouched in a hollow between 2 ridges, smaller than she expected and more stubborn. One side of the roof had sagged. Moss covered the north wall. The chimney leaned as if it had been listening for bad news for 30 years. A broken sign hung near the door, its letters almost gone beneath lichen. Marr Survey and Map Room. The county had called it useless, but someone had recently cared enough to clear the weeds from the step. Lydia stopped before crossing the yard. The ground was soft from last night's rain. Her own boots left narrow prints in the mud. Beside them, half filled with brown water, were wider tracks. A man's boots, fresh enough that the edges had not collapsed. She set her suitcase down. The cabin door stood closed, but not latched. When she touched it, it swung inward with a long wooden groan. No dust fell from the handle. Inside, the room smelled of wet paper, cold ashes, mouse straw, and something sharper. Lamp oil. Not old oil soaked into a shelf. Fresh oil, the kind that clung to the air after a flame had been blown out. Lydia did not move. There was a cot against the wall, with no blanket. A stove with rust around the mouth. shelves filled with rolled maps tied in string gone brown with age. On the far side sat a drafting table broad enough for a man to sleep across, its legs braced with iron, its surface gray beneath dust. But the dust was not even. A path had been wiped across the table, not wide enough to clean it, only wide enough for searching hands. Lydia shut the door and slid the rusted bolt into place. It did not feel like protection. It felt like a sound someone outside might hear. She wedged a broken chair beneath the latch, and only then allowed herself to breathe. The cabin had one corner dry enough for the night. She spread her coat there, placed the sewing tin under her folded dress, and ate 2 bites of bread, though her stomach had closed against food. Rain began after dark, tapping through the roof into a tin pan someone had left on the floor. Someone, that word would not leave her. Someone had opened the door. Someone had brought lamp oil. Someone had wiped the drafting table. Someone had stepped through fresh mud and gone exactly where Harlan Voss had not wanted her to look. Near midnight, Lydia rose with the lamp she had found beside the stove. Its wick had been trimmed clean. She crossed to the drafting table. The boards beneath it were darker than the rest of the floor, pressed down by years of weight. At first, she thought the mud stopped at the table legs. Then she lowered the lamp. A second track ran beneath the table, thin and smeared, as if someone had knelt there and dragged one muddy hand along the floor. It led straight under the old wood. Lydia held the lamp closer. And there, in the shadow below the drafting table, the mud ended at a place where the dust had been disturbed from underneath. Lydia did not sleep so much as disappear for a few minutes at a time. Every sound pulled her back. Rain in the pan, wind moving through the broken chimney, a branch scraping the north wall with the slow patience of fingernails. Once, near dawn, she woke with her hand closed around the sewing tin, so tightly the rim had pressed a circle into her palm. The cabin looked worse in morning light. Gray water had run down the inside of one wall and loosened strips of paper from the plaster. A family of mice had nested inside a drawer full of rusted dividers. The cot sagged in the middle. The stove smoked when she tried to light it, coughing black soot into the room until she had to open the door and let cold air pour in. But the cabin had not collapsed. That mattered. Lydia spent the first hour doing what her mother would have done. She took inventory. 1 cracked basin, 2 tin pans, a broom with half its straw, 3 candles melted sideways in a box, a stack of rolled maps on the west shelf, tied with string so brittle it broke when touched, a compass with a cracked glass face, a ruler warped by damp, a ledger too swollen to open, and the drafting table. She did not touch it yet. Instead, she cleared the floor around the stove, tore away the mouse straw, and found enough dry kindling in a lower drawer to coax a small flame alive. The warmth made the room smell sharper. Ink, mildew, iron, old glue. It also lifted the edges of the maps, hanging on the wall, so they moved slightly, as if breathing. Most were ruined. Rain had blurred the creak lines into blue bruises. Corners had curled. Whole sections had been chewed away. Still, Lydia could not stop looking. Her mother had taught her that bad maps often hid inside good paper. The trick was not to admire the drawing. The trick was to ask what the drawing wanted you to accept without question. On the largest map, Briar Creek lay neat and harmless in black ink. The orchard, the Vale property, the one Calvin had shut her out of, sat near the east ridge, boxed by a fence line Lydia knew by memory. But the fence was wrong. She leaned closer. On this old map, the rear boundary ran beyond the spring house and reached the stone wash where her mother had gathered mint. On the county map Lydia had once seen in the records office, that same line stopped short of the wash by nearly 40 yards. 40 yards was not a mistake. 40 yards was a pasture, a spring, a strip of timber, a place a man could steal if everyone agreed to call it measurement. Her breath changed. Near the lower edge of the map, almost hidden beneath a water stain, someone had written a name in pencil. Vale. Lydia touched it with one finger. The letters were small, but they were her mother's. The R tilted too far forward. The V had a slight break in its left arm, because Ruth Vale had once cut her hand on a canning jar and never held a pencil the same way again. Her mother had stood in this cabin, not in fever, not in confusion. Here. A knock struck the open doorframe. Lydia spun so fast her shoulder hit the wall. An old man stood outside with a dead rabbit hanging from one hand and a long rifle balanced in the crook of his elbow. His beard was white at the chin and yellow near the mouth. Rain had darkened his hat. His eyes moved past Lydia before they settled on her face, taking in the stove smoke, the maps, the suitcase, the table she had not touched. "You Ruth's girl," he said. It was not a question. Lydia picked up the warped ruler because it was the only thing near her hand. "Who are you?" "Abel Pike." The name meant nothing to her, but the way he stepped onto the threshold meant the cabin meant something to him. He did not cross inside. He looked at the floor first, then the table, then the wall where her mother's name waited in pencil. "You shouldn't have come alone. I did not have a choice. Choice is what men call it, after they close all the doors." That made Lydia lower the ruler a little. Abel nodded toward the maps. "You been reading those?" "Trying to." "Then stop reading them like pictures." Lydia frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means the lies are not in the hills, they are in the spaces between them." He shifted the rabbit to his other hand. "And if you compare anything in here with the maps inside the courthouse, do it with the door barred." Cold moved over Lydia's arms. "You worked with Elias Marr," she said. For the first time, Abel's face changed. Not much. Just enough to show pain before he covered it with weather. "I carried chains, held stakes, cooked coffee, sharpened pencils when his hands got bad." He looked at the drafting table again. He saw lines men paid good money not to see. What happened to him? Abel's jaw tightened. Outside, rain slid from the porch roof in silver threads. "Town says he lost his mind," he said. "And you?" "I say a man does not lose his mind because a map disagrees with him." Abel stepped backward, off the threshold. "He loses his place because powerful men decide the map would be cleaner without him on it." Lydia followed his gaze to the drafting table. "Did he leave something here?" Abel did not answer directly. He only looked toward the table and said, "Elias Marr did not leave this cabin. They made him vanish from it." Abel Pike left the rabbit on the porch rail and walked back into the trees before Lydia could ask him another question. For a long while, she stood with the door open, listening to his steps fade into the wet pines. He had not given her an answer she could hold. He had given her a warning that fit too neatly around everything she had already seen. By noon, the rain thinned to mist, and Lydia forced herself to work. Fear was useless if it did not move your hands. Behind the cabin, beneath weeds thick enough to hide a child, she found a round stone curb. A well. The rope broke the first time she pulled, dropping the bucket into darkness below. Lydia shut her eyes, swallowed the curse rising in her throat, and fetched a length of survey cord from a nail inside the cabin. It took her 20 minutes to knot it around the handle. When she lowered the bucket again, she expected the hollow scrape of an empty shaft. Instead, after several long seconds, she heard water. Not much. A soft slap at the bottom. Enough. She laughed once, a startled sound that frightened a crow from the roof. The water came up brown at first, then clearer after the third bucket. It tasted of stone, leaves, and rusted iron, but it was water. The county had marked the cabin useless. The cabin had answered with a well. That afternoon, she patched what she could. She stretched brittle canvas beneath the worst leak, cleaned the stove mouth with a bent ruler, and set Abel's rabbit into a pot with onion roots dug near the well. By evening, smoke rose from the chimney for the first time in years. The cabin was not a home, but it had stopped being only a ruin. After she ate, Lydia took down the large wall map and carried it to the drafting table. She did not open the table. Not yet. Whatever lay beneath it had waited this long. She needed to understand the lies on top of it first. She spread the map flat and placed stones on the corners. Then she unfolded the only county map she owned. A public road notice Calvin had once used to complain about taxes. It showed Briar County in thick official lines, printed in black, stamped with the courthouse seal. Side by side, the two maps looked almost the same. Almost was where theft lived. Lydia marked the Vale property with a candle stub. On the old map, the rear boundary followed the spring run, curved around the stonewash, and climbed toward a stand of hemlock. On the county notice, the line cut straight across before the spring, leaving the wash outside the property. Her mother had not lost 40 yards. Someone had moved it. Lydia checked again with the ruler and compass. Then she checked the mill stream. Then the old quarry road. Each time, the official line did not wander randomly. It moved with purpose. It trimmed water from one farm, timber from another, access from a third. A mistake scattered damage. This damage gathered value. A knock came just after sunset. Lydia froze. No one in Briar County should have known she had made smoke unless someone had been watching the chimney. She slid the ruler into her sleeve and opened the door only as far as the chair allowed. Harlan Voss stood on the step with his gray hat in both hands, as if he had come to offer condolences instead of bury them. Behind him, his carriage waited between the pines. The driver looked at the ground, where Lydia's footprints crossed the mud. "Miss Vale," Voss said, "may I speak plainly? You have so far." A faint smile touched his mouth, then vanished. "This place is unsafe. A young woman alone cannot remain here. The county marked it useless. That is not the same thing." His eyes moved past her shoulder. Not to the stove. Not to the cot. Not to the wet maps on the wall. To the drafting table. "I understand grief can make a person search for meaning in old things," he said. "But old paper has ruined more lives than it has saved." Lydia kept her hand on the door. "Did you come here to talk about paper?" "I came to prevent an unnecessary hardship." He withdrew an envelope from his coat. "The bank is prepared to settle your mother's outstanding debts. Quietly, in full. You would be given enough money to take a room in Millhaven and begin again." "Why?" "Because your mother was respected. My mother was thrown into debt before the flowers on her grave dried." Voss's smile tightened. "Careful, Miss Vale. Anger makes poor testimony." There it was. Not advice. Not sympathy. Preparation. Lydia looked at the envelope, then at the table behind her. "What would I have to sign?" "A simple acknowledgement that you have no further claim against the Vale property, this cabin, or any materials abandoned within it." The words entered the room colder than the evening air. Any materials. Not land, not furniture, not debts. Materials. Lydia let silence stretch until Voss shifted his weight. "Have you moved anything from the drafting table?" he asked. He asked it softly. Too softly. A line could be a promise, her mother had said, or a theft wearing good ink. A question could be a kindness, or a hand reaching for a locked drawer. Lydia lowered her eyes, the way men expected frightened girls to do. "I have been trying to make the stove work," she said. "Then keep your efforts there." He placed the envelope on the porch rail beside the rabbit blood Abel had left behind, the white paper soaked slowly at one corner. "You have until tomorrow evening," he said. "After that, the county may decide this structure is a danger to itself and others." When his carriage disappeared, Lydia did not touch the envelope. She turned back to the cabin. For the first time, the drafting table no longer looked like furniture. It looked like the reason a banker had driven into the woods at dusk. And only then did Lydia understand that Harlan Voss was not afraid she would live in the cabin. He was afraid she would look beneath the table. Lydia waited until the last sound of Voss's carriage had gone from the trees before she moved. The envelope still lay on the porch rail, its corner darkened by rabbit, blood, and mist. She did not open it. A paper from Harlan Voss would not tell her what he wanted. It would tell her what he wanted her to think he wanted. Instead, she barred the door, set the lamp on the drafting table, and studied the wood. In daylight, the table had looked old. Under lamplight, it looked watchful. Its surface was gray, scarred by compass points and knife marks. Ink stains had sunk into it like bruises. Along the front edge, where a draftsman's hands would rest, the wood had worn smooth. But beneath that wear, almost hidden under dust and swelling, Lydia saw a line. Not a crack. A sem. It ran along the underside of the table, too straight for rot and too careful for repair. She knelt and touched it. The groove was packed with dirt so fine it felt like powder. When she rubbed it between finger and thumb, something caught the light. Copper. Her breath stopped. The sewing tin sat on the cot where she had left it. Lydia took out the longest needle, the one her mother had used for canvas and heavy hems. Its tip was slightly bent, but it slid into the seam better than any knife. Inch by inch, Lydia scraped away the packed dust. The table had two skins, a false face above, something hidden below. She worked until her knees hurt and her shoulders stiffened. Twice the needle slipped and bit into her thumb. A bead of blood rose, bright as sealing wax. She wrapped it in her handkerchief and kept going. Near the right corner, she found a mark that did not belong to age. A fresh cut. Someone had tried to force the seam open with a blade recently. The edge was raw beneath the gray surface, pale wood exposed where no old dust had settled. Lydia held the lamp closer and saw another mark beside it, then another. Whoever had come before her had known exactly where to pry. Her mind went first to Abel Pike. He knew the cabin. He knew Elias Marr. He had looked at the table as if it were a grave he did not want opened. Maybe his warning had not been kindness. Maybe it had been fear that Lydia would find what he had failed to take. She moved the lamp away from the window. Outside, the rain had stopped. The woods had gone too quiet. Then something touched the door. Not wind. A hand. The latch lifted once, slowly, and dropped against the chair Lydia had wedged beneath it. She blew out the lamp. Darkness swallowed the room. The latch lifted again. Lydia stood barefoot on the cold floor, one hand over her mouth, the bent needle clutched in the other. Through the gap beneath the door, she saw a shadow cut across the threshold. Whoever stood outside did not knock. He waited. Then a thin blade slid between the door and frame, searching for the bolt. Lydia backed toward the stove, found the iron poker, and raised it with both hands. The blade worked higher. The chair creaked. Then, from somewhere beyond the porch, an owl cried. The blade vanished. Boots moved across the boards, down the step, into the mud. Lydia held still until her arms trembled. Only when the woods had settled again did she relight the lamp. The floor near the door was wet. On it lay a narrow knife with a bone handle, not dropped by accident. Placed. Lydia stared at it, then crossed to the door and opened it a hand's width. No one stood outside. But in the mud beyond the porch, she saw two sets of prints, one broad and deep, leading away toward the road. The other lighter, older, coming from the trees and stopping near the rail. Beside the knife was a scrap of paper folded once. She opened it with shaking fingers. Not words. A drawing. The same bent hook from her mother's sewing tin, followed by a short straight line and a small circle beneath it. A key without language. Abel. Lydia looked into the dark trees. She could not see him, but she understood now. The man at the door had come to break in. The man from the trees had come close enough to scare him off, then left her what she needed. She shut the door and carried the bone-handled knife to the table. It was thin, flexible, made for skinning small game. It slid into the seam where the needle had only scratched. Lydia worked slowly, afraid of breaking whatever mechanism old Mar had built. At first, nothing moved. Then, the right corner lifted with a soft wooden sigh. Not much. Enough. She wedged the ruler beneath it, then the knife, then both hands. The false top resisted like a coffin lid swollen by rain. Lydia pulled until pain shot through her shoulders. The wood gave. A strip of dust fell from inside the table, glittering copper in the lamplight. Beneath the false surface lay a shallow compartment lined with oilcloth. Inside were thin metal plates, stacked in careful rows, each one wrapped at the edge, with paper darkened by age. Lydia lifted the first one. It was heavier than it looked. Letters had been stamped into its face. Not decorative letters. Working letters. Names. Boundary marks. Dates. Tiny lines cut with such precision they seemed less drawn than sworn. She saw Shaw, then Elder, then Pruitt. Names of families she had heard all her life. Families people said had sold badly, signed poorly, lost land because they were careless, weak, or unlucky. At the bottom of the stack, half hidden beneath the others, Lydia saw one more name. Vale. The lamp flame bent in the draft from the broken wall. And under that ruined drafting table, Lydia understood the dead maps on the wall had only been the cover. The county's real memory had been buried in metal. Lydia did not lift the veil plate first. She wanted to. Her hand went toward it twice, then stopped. That name sat at the bottom of the stack like a wound she was not ready to touch. If she began with her mother, grief would read for her. Her mother had taught her better than that. So Lydia began with Shaw. The plate was brass, not copper, though age had darkened it toward brown. Its surface had been etched with fine boundary lines and stamped with small numbers along the edges. In one corner was the mark from her sewing tin, 3 short lines, 1 bent hook, and a small unfinished number. Lydia pulled the scrap of brown paper from the tin and laid it beside the plate. The marks matched. Not nearly. Exactly. Her mother had not left her a memory. She had left her a key. For several minutes, Lydia could only stare at the 2 marks side by side, one scratched by a surveyor's tool into brass, the other drawn by Ruth Vale's careful hand on cheap paper. The cabin around her seemed to narrow, until there was only the table, the flame, the metal, and the impossible fact that her mother had known where to send her. Then Lydia made herself work. She cleared the table, set the plates in rows, and used strips of torn paper to label each family name. Shaw. Alder, Pruitt, Mercer, Vale, Donnelly, Fields. A dozen more she knew from church pews, market lines, and weathered mailboxes along county roads. These were not rich names. That was the first pattern. They belonged to widows, tenant farmers who had nearly paid off their land, families with no sons old enough to argue, old men who could not read fine print without help. People the town had always described with the same soft cruelty: unlucky, careless, behind on payments, poor at business. Lydia took down the official county notice and placed it beside the brass plates. The second pattern appeared faster. Every old boundary that touched water had been shortened. A spring cut away from Shaw. A creek bend removed from Alder. A mill path shifted off Donnelly land. Timber trimmed from Pruitt land and added to a parcel now held by the bank. Access roads moved just enough to make a farm useless without making the theft visible to anyone who did not know where to look. Her hands went cold. This was not a mistake repeated. This was a method. Lydia found Elias Marr's handwriting on slips of paper tucked beneath the plates. Some notes were only measurements. Some were questions. A few were written with such pressure the pencil had torn the paper. Same seal used twice. Tax roll does not match north line. Widow signed after recorded death. Ask Ruth Vale about spring boundary. The last note made Lydia sit down. Ask Ruth Vale. Her mother had not stumbled into this. She had been part of it somehow. Not as a victim only. As someone Elias Marr trusted enough to name. Lydia pressed both hands flat on the table until the shaking slowed. Outside, wind moved against the cabin wall. Inside, the lamp hissed. She turned toward the shelves and searched again, this time not for maps, but for order. Elias had not hidden these plates randomly. Men who risked their lives to keep truth did not bury it like junk. On the lower shelf, behind a row of mold-spotted ledgers, she found a narrow book wrapped in oilcloth. Its cover had no title. Inside were dates, initials, and page numbers that matched the plate corners. Elias Marr had made an index. Lydia read, until the candle burned low. The index did not accuse in grand language. It did not need to. It showed the same courthouse seal appearing after the same bank signatures. It showed parcels shrinking just before loans were called. It showed land moving toward 3 families and 1 institution with a patience more frightening than force. Harlan Voss's bank appeared again and again, not always under his name, sometimes under his father's, sometimes under shell companies whose titles sounded like roads, mills, or improvement trusts. But the pattern pointed to the same hand reaching through years. Then Lydia found the page marked Vale. Her throat closed before she turned to the plate. The brass piece bearing her family name was smaller than the rest, not because the land was smaller, but because one corner had been broken away. The missing piece had taken the date of the original survey and part of the witness mark. Without it, the plate showed the old boundary, but not when it had been measured. Without the date, Voss could call it outdated, decorative, a rejected draft, a dead map from a dead man. Lydia ran her thumb along the jagged edge. It had not broken by accident. The cut was too clean. Someone had removed the exact corner that could prove her mother's land had been changed after the true survey was recorded. For the first time since opening the table, Lydia almost put everything back. She saw the choice with terrible clarity. She could take only the Vale papers, hide the rest, and use them to frighten Calvin Mercer into giving back what he had stolen. Maybe Voss would settle quietly. Maybe she could sleep in her mother's room again before winter. Maybe no one else would have to know she had found the county's buried heart. Then she looked at the other names. Shaw, Alder, Pruitt, Donnelly. Mrs. Alder had warned her at the gate with fear in her voice. Mr. Pruitt had lowered his eyes at the porch because shame had trained him to. The shopkeeper had not touched her fingers. How many of them had lost pieces of their lives and been told it was their own fault? Lydia thought of her mother drawing flower lines on the kitchen table. A line can be a promise, or it can be a theft wearing good ink. Near dawn, Lydia carried 3 plates to the floor and placed them over the official county map. The brass lines did not merely disagree with the printed lines. They explained them. The official map was not wrong everywhere. It was wrong only where wrongness profited someone. That made it worse. A liar who changed everything could be called foolish. A liar who changed only what he needed could become a banker. Lydia took the oilcloth ledger, wrapped the plates again, and moved them from the table to a loose stone beneath the stove. She kept out only the Shaw plate, the Vale plate, and the index page that carried Harlan Voss's name through his father's old company. She would need proof beyond the cabin. Tax records, old deeds, witnesses. Someone who remembered Elias Marr before the town called him mad, and she would need Abel. The sun had not risen when she stepped onto the porch. Mist lay low over the hollow. The well rope hung dark with dew. Far down the trail, a crow lifted from a pine and disappeared toward Briar Creek. Lydia held the Vale plate against her chest, careful of the missing corner. She had come to the cabin wanting one thing, a way back into her mother's house. Now the house seemed smaller than it had yesterday. Beneath the county, everyone saw, there was another county made of stolen springs, shortened fences, erased roads, and widows taught to blame themselves. And if Lydia set the brass plates side by side, the truth would not only return land to the dead, it could take it back from the living. By mid-morning, Lydia learned how quickly a town could turn a closed door into a verdict. She had not gone back to Briar Creek with the brass plates. She wrapped the Vale plate, the Shaw plate, and the index page in oilcloth, tucked them beneath the false bottom of her suitcase, and walked down only for food, lamp oil, and access to the public tax notices pinned outside the courthouse. But by the time she reached the first storefront, people already knew. Not the truth, only the version someone wanted them to carry. The barber stopped sweeping when she passed. Mrs. Alder saw her from behind a curtain and let it drop. Two men outside the feed store lowered their voices, then said just loudly enough that grief made some girls dangerous. At the grocer's counter, the same man who had sold her bread folded his hands over the ledger. "Cash only," he said. "I paid cash yesterday. Today is different." Lydia understood before he finished speaking. Harlan Voss had gone to work while she was still reading Elias Marr's hidden index by lamplight. "What did they tell you?" she asked. The grocer would not meet her eyes. "They said you removed county materials from an abandoned survey office." "It was not a county office. That is not what the bank says." "The bank. Not the sheriff. Not the clerk. The bank." Lydia bought flour, salt, and lamp oil with coins that suddenly seemed too few, then crossed to the courthouse wall where tax notices were nailed behind warped glass. She copied what she could through the grime. Parcel numbers, acreage, delinquent dates. 3 names from the brass plates appeared on the same list, each with acreage smaller than the old boundaries showed. Shaw had lost 14 acres. Elda, Neen. Pruitt, 21. Her pencil snapped on the last number. Miss Vale. Calvin Mercer stood behind her in his dark coat, the same coat he had worn while handing her suitcase away like trash. His eyes were red, but not from sorrow, from drink or sleeplessness. "You need to stop this," he said. Lydia folded the paper. "Stop reading? Stop making accusations. I have not made any in public. You have been seen with old maps. That is not a crime. It can become one if the maps do not belong to you." She looked at him closely. His left thumb worried the edge of his cuff, rubbing the fabric the way he had rubbed the hidden corner of the debt note. "Which map worries you, Calvin?" His hand stilled. "I did not say I was worried. No, you came all the way to the courthouse wall to prove you were not." His face hardened. "You think Ruth left you something? She left you sickness, debts, and a habit of seeing traps where decent men see law." Lydia stepped closer. "Then why did Harlan Voss ask about the drafting table?" Calvin's eyes flicked once toward the bank across the square. There it was, a line out of place. Before Lydia could press him, the courthouse door opened, and Deputy Clerk Amos Reed came out with papers under one arm. He was young, pale, and nervous enough that the papers shook when he saw Lydia. "Miss Vale," he said, "the county has posted notice on the Marr structure." He pushed a paper toward her. "Unsafe property. Subject to removal." The order had been signed that morning. Lydia read the date twice. "No one inspected it," Amos swallowed. "The county received sufficient concern." From whom? He did not answer. Instead, his gaze dropped to the folded notes in her hand, then moved to the alley beside the courthouse. For a fraction of a second, he shook his head. Not refusal, warning. Then he walked away. Lydia carried the notice back through the woods as clouds piled low over the ridges. Halfway up the logging road, she realized she was being followed. Not by footsteps. By absence. A squirrel went silent. A crow lifted from brush too far ahead. Someone knew the trail and kept out of sight. She did not run. Running told a watcher what you carried. At the cabin, nothing looked changed from outside. The door was still barred the way she had left it. The stove ash was cold. The maps hung limp in the damp air. Then she smelled it. Oil. Not lamp oil in the room. Kerosene, sharp and raw, from outside the walls. A dark line circled the cabin's base, where the moss met the lower logs. Someone had poured kerosene along the foundation, careful and patient. Thickest near the dry side of the porch. One match would not burn the cabin down cleanly. It would trap anyone sleeping inside first. For a moment, Lydia could not breathe. Then she ran to the stove. The loose stone beneath it was still in place. Her hands shook as she pulled it free. The wrapped bundle was there. But when she opened it, one plate was missing. Shaw, the old widow's name, was gone. Lydia searched the compartment twice, though she knew. Whoever had taken it had known which one to lift. Not Vale, not the index. Shaw. At dusk, she found the tracks behind the cabin. Small boots. A woman's. Pressed deep in the mud as if she had been hurrying with something heavy under her coat. The prints cut downhill through blackberry and fern toward the old mill stream. Lydia followed them with the kerosene still burning in her nose. She found Miriam Shaw beneath the collapsed footbridge, wrapped in a brown shawl, clutching the brass plate against her chest, as if it were a child she had stolen back from the grave. She was smaller than Lydia remembered, with rain in the seams of her face and terror making her mouth tremble. "I am not giving it to them," Miriam said before Lydia spoke. "I did not come for them." The old woman laughed once, broken and bitter. "Everyone comes for them sooner or later." Lydia crouched in the mud. "Mrs. Shaw, that plate may help prove what happened to your land." Miriam pulled it tighter. "My husband proved it once. Elias Marr proved it once. Ruth Vale came asking after it once. And every time someone proved a thing, another door closed, another man lost work, another widow learned to keep quiet. Rain began again, soft at first, then harder through the leaves. "Did you take it to hide it?" Lydia asked. Miriam's eyes lifted. "I took it because if you read all those names, they will know whose doors to knock on next." She looked back toward the ridge, toward the cabin ringed with oil. "If you read all those names, child, they will come for both of us." Miriam Shaw did not return the plate until Lydia stopped asking for it. That was the first lesson the old widow gave her. Fear did not loosen when pushed. It loosened when someone sat beside it long enough to prove they had not come with another set of hands. So Lydia sat beneath the collapsed footbridge while rain gathered on her shoulders and the mill stream moved black over stones. Miriam kept the brass plate under her shawl. For nearly 10 minutes, neither of them spoke. At last, Lydia said, "My mother came to you." Miriam's fingers tightened. "She came after dark," the old woman whispered. "Brought bread, thread, and a copy of my husband's deed folded inside a church bulletin. Said if anyone asked, we were mending sleeves." "Why did she have your deed?" "Because I was fool enough to take it to the courthouse." The bitterness in Miriam's voice was old, but not dull. It still had teeth. She told Lydia how her husband, Joseph Shaw, had bought 14 acres beyond the creek bend before their first child was born. Good bottomland. A shallow spring, enough willow to sell basketwood in winter. When Joseph died, the bank called a note Miriam had never seen. The county map showed the creek bend outside her boundary. The deed she held said otherwise. "I showed them," Miriam said. "They smiled like I had brought them a recipe instead of proof." Then the deed disappeared from the clerk's desk. Lydia felt the cold move into her bones. Elias Marr knew? He measured it himself. Said the line had been moved after Joseph's death. Said mine was not the only one. Miriam looked toward the ridge. 2 weeks later, Elias stopped answering his door. "And my mother?" "Your mother copied what she could. She said a girl should not inherit a lie just because men had polished it." For the first time since the funeral, Lydia had to look away. Miriam slowly drew the Shaw plate from beneath her shawl and set it on the mud between them. "I do not trust courage," she said. "Courage gets poor people buried, but I trusted your mother. So I will tell you where she hid my deed." The deed was not in Miriam's house. That would have been too easy. It was sewn behind the lining of a flour sack, hanging in the abandoned smokehouse, where Miriam still dried herbs, because no one thought an old woman's herbs worth searching. Lydia cut the stitches with her mother's needle while Miriam held a lantern. The paper inside was brittle, but the ink had survived. Joseph Shaw's name stood on the deed. So did the creek bend. That night, They carried it to the cabin. Abel Pike was waiting on the porch. He did not apologize for frightening Lydia 2 nights before. He only looked at the kerosene darkening the foundation and said, "They have moved faster than I hoped." "You knew this would happen," Lydia said. "I knew men who fear old lines do not wait for new ones to be drawn." Inside, Abel laid the Shaw plate, the deed, and the county tax notice side by side. He used a splinter of charcoal to mark 3 points: Spring, Creek Bend, Willow Stand. Elias used witness points, he said. A boundary can be argued. A spring, a stone, a tree with a scar through it, those are harder to lie about if someone still knows where they stand. You can testify to that? Abel's face went still. I can show you how to prove it. That is not the same. Miriam gave a small, humorless laugh. Old men like us survive by knowing when not to stand in front. Lydia wanted to be angry with them both. Instead, she understood. They had already paid for truth once. Before dawn, another paper appeared beneath the cabin door. Not thrown, slipped. Lydia opened it with the stove poker. It was a copied page from the county tax roll. No name, no note, but one parcel number had been circled 3 times. Shaw. The acreage listed there was smaller than the deed, smaller than Elias's plate, smaller than the land Miriam's husband had paid for. At the bottom, in the clerk's narrow hand, someone had written, "Check death date against transfer." "Amos Reed," Lydia said. Abel nodded. "The boy has a conscience. That makes him useful and endangered." They went to the graveyard before the town woke. Miriam led them to Joseph Shaw's stone. Lydia rubbed damp moss away with her sleeve. The date of death was clear. October 3. The transfer in the copied tax roll was dated October 17, 2 weeks after a dead man had supposedly signed away the land beside his own creek. Lydia stared at the numbers until they seemed to burn through the page. By noon, Miriam had given her 2 more names. A carpenter named Donnelly, whose access road vanished from the county map. A widow named Fields, whose spring had been corrected onto bankland. Abel drew the old witness points from memory. Lydia marked each one against the plates. The pattern held. Not perfectly. Perfect lies were easier to suspect. These lies were careful, small, useful. Late that afternoon, while Lydia sorted the deed, the plate, and the tax roll across the drafting table, she saw the same embossed seal on 3 different papers. One was on Miriam's missing transfer. One was on the notice against the Marr cabin. One was on the debt note Calvin had tried to hide with his thumb. The seal was not the county's. It belonged to the office of Harlan Voss. The courthouse meeting room had been built for taxes, marriages, and quiet arguments over fence lines. By the time Lydia arrived, it was a trial. Men lined the back wall. Women sat in the side benches, some with faces Lydia recognized from the brass plates, some looking away before she could meet their eyes. At the long table sat 3 commissioners, Deputy Clerk Amos Reed and Harlan Voss. Calvin Mercer sat near Voss. That was how Lydia knew they had arranged the room before she entered it. She carried no lawyer, father, or husband. Only her mother's sewing tin, a rolled map, 3 copied tax pages, the Shaw deed, the Shaw plate, the damaged Vale plate, and Elias Marr's oilcloth index. Miriam Shaw walked beside her until the doorway, then stopped. "I will sit close," the old woman whispered. "That is not the same as standing," Lydia said, but gently. Miriam's eyes lowered. "I know." Through the window, Lydia could see Abel Pike outside, hat low, leaning on the hitching rail like a man waiting for weather to decide. The chairman struck the table with a gavel. "This meeting concerns an unsafe property notice and disputed materials removed from the Marr survey cabin." "Disputed by whom?" Lydia asked. A murmur ran through the room. Voss rose slowly. "By the county, Miss Vale, and by any citizen who respects law more than grief." There it was. The first cut. He did not call her a liar yet. He made her pain the reason no one should listen. "This young woman has suffered," Voss said, "but grief can drive the mind toward patterns. She has occupied an abandoned structure, handled deteriorated materials, and begun making claims that could unsettle lawful ownership across this county." "I brought records," Lydia said. "You brought objects without chain of custody." The phrase sounded important. Several men nodded, though Lydia doubted they understood it. Voss turned to the commissioners. "We must ask whether these plates are genuine, whether Miss Vale altered them, and whether her desire to reclaim property from her stepfather has colored her judgment." Calvin lowered his head at the perfect moment, as if wounded. The room shifted against her. Lydia felt it like the blade under the cabin door. Quiet pressure, searching for the latch. She placed the Shaw deed on the table first. Not the Vale plate. Joseph Shaw bought 14 acres beyond the creek bend, Lydia said. His deed says so. The county tax roll later lists the acreage smaller. The transfer is dated October 17th. Voss folded his hands. Clerical corrections happen. Joseph Shaw died October 3rd. This time, the room did not murmur. It inhaled. Lydia laid the copied grave record beside the transfer page Amos had slipped under her door. She did not look at Amos, but saw his fingers whiten around his pen. A dead man cannot sign away a creek bend 2 weeks after burial, she said. Voss's smile thinned. A copied page slipped to a desperate woman is not evidence. No, Lydia said. It is a door. She set the Shaw plate down. Brass touched wood with a small, sharp sound. She turned it so the commissioners could see the etched creek bend, the spring mark, and the witness scar Abel had taught her to name. This plate matches the Shaw deed. It matches the old witness points. It does not match the county map. Because it is old, Voss said. Old maps disagree. That is why counties correct them. Then why did every correction move water away from poor owners and toward bank-controlled parcels? The chairman looked up. Voss answered too quickly. That is reckless. Lydia unrolled the old cabin map. Then the county road notice. Then the tax copies. One by one, she marked the pattern. Shaw's Spring, Alder's Timber, Donnelly's Access Road, Field's Well Path, Pruitt's North Pasture. Names began to move through the room. People whispered because they understood their own names. Voss stood straighter. This is theater. No, Lydia said. Theater asks people to look where nothing happened. I am asking them to look where their land went. A commissioner leaned toward the Vale plate. What about your own family claim? Lydia knew that question was coming. She dreaded it anyway. She placed the damaged plate on the table. The missing corner looked worse in daylight. Jagged. Convenient. Cruel. Voss seized on it. There. The very plate that would benefit Miss Vale is incomplete. Calvin lifted his head. Ruth was sick near the end. She saw things in papers that were not there. Lydia's hand closed around the sewing tin. For one breath, anger nearly took her voice. Then she opened the tin. My mother kept what men thought too small to matter. From beneath the needles and buttons, she removed the broken brass corner wrapped in brown paper. The same paper on which Ruth Vale had drawn the bent hook. A sound rose from the benches as Lydia fitted the piece to the plate. It matched. The date appeared whole. The witness mark appeared whole. The true Vale boundary stood complete beneath the courthouse lamps. Calvin pushed back from his chair. Voss did not. He only stared at the plate. Then he made his mistake. That piece was under the table, he said. Silence came down so fast, it seemed to strike the windows. Lydia looked at him. What table? Voss's face changed by no more than a finger's width, but everyone had heard him. I never told this room where the plates were hidden, Lydia said. The chairman turned slowly. Mr. Voss? Voss recovered. It was common knowledge Mar kept a drafting table. Not under it, Lydia said. You said under. Amos Reed stood so abruptly his chair scraped the floor. Voss snapped. Sit down, Mr. Reed. Amos did not. He placed a file on the table. The county seal was not used on several transfers. The embossed seal came from Voss Land and Trust. I copied the impressions after Miss Vale showed me the pattern. The room broke open. Voices rose. A commissioner shouted for order. Calvin edged toward the side door, but Mrs. Alder stood with sudden courage and blocked the aisle. Still, Voss had one last wall. None of this proves Elias Marr certified those plates, he said. Without Marr's confirmation, these are scraps from a madman's cabin. The words hit hard, because Abel was still outside, because the dead could not step into rooms where the living were afraid to speak for them. Then the back door opened. Abel Pike entered without his rifle. Rain silvered his coat. His hat was in his hand. I carried Marr's chains, he said. I held stakes on every line that girl laid out on that table. And I watched Harlan Voss's father offer Elias money to forget where water ran. Voss turned pale with fury. You cannot prove that. Abel placed a rusted survey chain beside the plates. On one link was the same bent hook mark. I can prove those plates were Marr's, Abel said. And I can prove which men were afraid of them. Miriam Shaw stood then, slowly, shaking, but standing. "My husband did not sell our creek," she said. After her, Mrs. Alder rose. Then Mr. Pruitt. Then two women Lydia did not know, each saying a name that had been taught to sound like failure until the brass plates gave it back its dignity. The chairman struck the gavel again, but this time not to silence Lydia. "To suspend the unsafe notice," he said, "to secure the Marr cabin and all materials therein, to open review of the disputed transfers." Lydia looked at Voss. For the first time, he had no gentle words ready. But as the room surged around the table, Lydia saw Calvin slip through the side door, and in his hand was Elias Marr's oilcloth index. Lydia did not shout when she saw Calvin leave with the index. Shouting would have turned every head toward the wrong panic. Instead, she moved. She slipped between the benches while the commissioners argued over custody of the plates, past Mrs. Alder, past Miriam Shaw still trembling beside her chair, and reached the side door just as it swung shut behind Calvin's coat. The alley outside smelled of wet brick and horses. Calvin was already halfway to the bank. For one terrible second, Lydia saw the whole thing clearly. The oilcloth book in his hand, the stove inside Voss's office, Elias Marr's patient numbers curling into black ash before anyone thought to look for them. Then Amos Reed came through the courthouse door behind her. "He has the index," Lydia said. Amos went white. Together they ran. Calvin heard them at the bank steps and turned. There was no grief left in his face now. No borrowed sorrow, no careful patience. Only the mean fear of a man whose lies had depended on everyone staying smaller than him. "You should have taken the money," he said. "You should have left my mother's name alone." He shoved through the bank door. By the time Lydia reached the office, Calvin had the stove open and one corner of the oilcloth smoking in his fist. Amos knocked his arm aside. The book fell against the hearth. Flame caught the edge. Lydia grabbed it with both hands. Heat bit her palms. She pulled anyway. The first pages were blackened. Several numbers had vanished into lace-edged holes, but the spine held. Most of the book still breathed smoke instead of ash. Voss appeared behind the desk. For the first time, he did not look clean. "Give that here," he said. Amos stepped between them. His voice shook, but he did not move. "This office is now under review by order of the commissioners." Voss laughed once. "You are a clerk, and you used a private seal on county transfers." That stopped him. Behind them, men from the meeting filled the bank doorway. Then women. Then Commissioner Hale, rain dripping from his coat, looked at the burned book in Lydia's hands, and then at Calvin, standing beside the open stove. No one had to ask what Calvin had meant to do. Some guilt entered rooms as loudly as confession. The index was carried back to the courthouse under 3 witnesses. The damaged pages made Voss smile again for one brief moment, until Abel Pike asked for the plates. "Elias knew paper burns," Abel said. He turned one brass plate over. Along the back edge were tiny punch marks Lydia had mistaken for age. Abel laid the burned index beside it and tapped the holes. "Page, parcel, witness point." He marked the plates twice, once for men who could read, once for men who would try to burn the reading. Lydia bent close. The punch marks matched the surviving pages. Not all of them. Enough. Enough was not victory. Enough was a door that would not close. By sundown, the commissioners suspended every disputed transfer named in the surviving index and ordered the Marr cabin sealed, not for demolition, but protection. The county map was withdrawn from public use. Harlan Voss was not dragged out in chains. Men like him rarely were on the first day. But his bank books were taken. His private seal was locked in a courthouse drawer. Calvin Mercer was held for destruction of evidence. Lydia signed 3 statements before her hands stopped shaking. When they asked where she would stay, no one suggested her mother's house. That hurt more than she expected. The house remained tied in review, its rooms still behind doors Calvin had closed. "You can take a room in town," Commissioner Hale said. Lydia looked through the courthouse window toward the dark line of pines. The cabin was wet, smoke-stained, and ringed by kerosene. Its roof still leaked, its stove still coughed. It had nearly gotten her killed, but it had also kept what her mother could not say aloud. "No," Lydia said. "I will stay where the maps are." The next morning, men from the county rode with her to Marr cabin, not to tear it down, to post a guard. Amos carried the surviving index. Abel carried the survey chain. Miriam Shaw carried her husband's deed pressed flat inside a Bible. When the courthouse seal was placed over the false county map, Lydia did not watch it for long. She looked past the road, past the town, toward the pines. For the first time, the cabin did not look like the only place left to her. It looked like the first place that had told her the truth. Winter came early to the pines that year. It came first as frost on the well rope, then as a white edge along the cabin roof, then as a silence that settled over Briar County after too many men realized the ground beneath them had been measured twice, once by truth, once by hunger. The investigation did not move quickly. Truth rarely did when it had to pass through rooms built by the people who had buried it. Harlan Voss hired lawyers from Millhaven. Calvin Mercer claimed fear had made him carry the index away. Some families who had gained land by false lines said they had not known. Some had not. Some had known enough to stay quiet. Lydia learned that justice was not a door opening all at once. It was a hinge, rusted and stubborn, moved a little each day. The Vale house remained locked through the first snow. That hurt less by December than it had in October. Lydia still missed the orchard, the kitchen window, the cedar box her mother had kept beside the bed, but she no longer walked past the house like a child left outside her own life. She had work now. Every morning, she lit the stove in Mar cabin before the sun reached the ridge. Abel repaired the porch steps without asking permission. Amos brought copied pages from the courthouse under proper seal this time, his handwriting steadier than before. Miriam Shaw came twice a week with bread wrapped in cloth and sat beside the table while Lydia matched deeds to plates, plates to witness points to old scars in trees and stones that had never learned to lie. People began arriving quietly. First Mrs. Alder, carrying a tax receipt tied in blue thread. Then Mr. Pruitt, who stood outside for 20 minutes before stepping in. Then a woman named Elsie Fields, whose spring had appeared on 3 different maps in 3 different places, none of them near the place where her children had carried water. They came ashamed at first, as if losing land had been a private failure instead of a public theft. Lydia knew that shame, so she never asked, "Why did you not fight?" She asked, "What did the old line touch? A spring, a stone wall, a pear tree, a burial plot, a road to a barn, a creek bend where a husband had proposed. A patch of timber planted by a father who never lived to cut it. Piece by piece, the county beneath the county rose onto the drafting table. By spring, the cabin no longer smelled of mildew first. It smelled of coffee, stove smoke, oiled wood, and paper drying near the hearth. The roof still showed its scars, but it did not leak. The broken sign outside had been cleaned, not replaced. Lydia had asked Abel to leave the missing letters alone. Mar survey and map room. Let people see what time had tried to erase. The drafting table stayed where it had always stood. Its false top was no longer hidden. Lydia kept it open under a sheet of glass Amos ordered from Millhaven, so visitors could see the compartment where the brass plates had slept through years of lies. On the wall above it, she hung the old county map, not the official one, Elias Mars. The first time Lydia placed her mother's name beneath the Vale boundary, her hands shook so badly Miriam had to hold the pin. Ruth Vale had left no grand letter, no confession, no speech from beyond the grave, only a sewing tin, a bent hook mark, and lessons Lydia had once thought were strange. But as Lydia stepped back and saw R. Vale written in clean ink below the restored line, she understood. Her mother had not left her a house. A house could be locked. Her mother had left her a way to read the lock. Months later, when the first corrected markers were driven into the earth beyond the Shaw Creek bend, Miriam did not cry. She stood with both hands on her cane and watched the surveyor set the stake where Joseph Shaw had always said it belonged. Then she touched the top of it once. "That is enough," she said. It was not everything. 14 acres did not return the years. A corrected deed did not bring back a husband, a spring, a season of harvest lost to another man's fence. But it changed the sentence people had spoken over her life. She had not failed. She had been robbed, and now the record said so. One by one, other records began to say it too. Not all, not quickly, not without argument. But enough for people to walk into Mar cabin with folded papers and leave standing straighter than when they came. On the first warm day of summer, Lydia opened both windows and let pine air move through the room. Sunlight crossed the drafting table, touched the brass plates, and rested on the blue sewing tin beside them. She kept it there always, not because she needed the scrap anymore. She knew the mark by heart now. She kept it there because every true map needed to remember the hand that first pointed the way. Outside, Abel was repairing the fence. Amos was arguing with a commissioner over storage shelves. Miriam had fallen asleep in the chair by the stove, her shawl folded over her knees. Lydia stood before the wall map and traced the Vale line without touching it. For the first time in her life, she did not feel small beside the borders men had drawn. She did not fear the ink. She did not fear the paper. Because she knew now that a line could be a theft, yes. But in the hands of someone brave enough to read it, a line could also become a way home.